I am Deborah Cohen. I'm a faculty member in the history department and the director of the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. We are just delighted to have Professor Benjamin Nathans with us today to talk about his extraordinary book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause. If you haven't already read this book, please just rush out and get it. It is just an extraordinary, extraordinary book. It's the definitive history of the Soviet dissident movement, an immersive account of how a few free-thinking first children of the Soviet system, as Nathans describes them, sought to conduct themselves as free people. It's also a very timely analysis of the ways in which dissident movements, protest movements develop and are sustained, even when the likelihood of all success appears to be slim, if not hopeless. To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause has very, very deservedly won a whole slew of prizes, including the Pushkin House Prize, the Vucenich Prize, the Zelnick Prize, and the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction. And as people who have judged this prize know, actually the nonfiction prize is the hardest one, I would say, to win, because it is a catch-all category that includes all history that's not US, in addition to journalism and every other kind of nonfiction, other than biography. Professor Nathans is the Alan Charles Kors Endowed Professor of History at Penn. His research spans the imperial as well as the Soviet periods. His first book was the wonderful Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, which won the major prizes in Jewish as in Russian history. And he writes regularly for the New York Review of Books. Joining Professor Nathans in conversation today is Masha Lipman, who is the Roberta Buffett Professor of International Studies. Lipman is an analyst and commentator who served as the editor for the Carnegie Moscow Center's journal, Pro et Contra. She's written on Russia for many publications, including The New Yorker and Foreign Affairs. And Masha reviewed Ben's book for Foreign Affairs. So to welcome you both, so they'll talk for 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, the Buffett Institute, for organizing this event today. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Benjamin Nathans, a brilliant historian and the author of the book that you see here. I think that for Americans of a certain age, there's no need to explain who the dissidents were. There was a time, and a long time it was, beginning in the 60s and through the 70s, and even early 80s maybe, when the Soviet dissidents were actually covered very broadly in the American media. And this generated quite a lot of sympathy and support among the Americans in the United States for their cause. There were also not a few Americans who actually actively supported the cause of the dissidents in Russia. However, there are much younger people in the audience who may have never heard about the Soviet dissidents. And I should say that in Russia proper, these days, barely anyone would remember who the dissidents were or remember their names. Okay. And so to begin with, I would like to ask you to just say a few words who the dissidents were and what their cause was and why do you call it hopeless. And also, when did you decide to write, when and why you decided to write a book about them, and what were your sources?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's amazing to see this many people coming out in this beautiful salon-like setting. I do want to express my gratitude to Deborah Cohen for inviting me to come here and speak with Masha Lipman and to take your questions and talk about the history of Soviet dissent. By way of describing the movement in general terms, this was largely a group of intellectuals in the Soviet Union, people who were born after the Bolshevik Revolution and were themselves fully formed by the Soviet system. They were Soviet people. They were educated in Soviet schools. They grew up surrounded by the force field of Soviet propaganda, which was ubiquitous. They were employed in one way or another by the Soviet state, because in the Soviet system, everyone was an employee in one way or another of the Soviet state. Part of the interest of the project for me from the outset was to ask, how did this kind of movement emerge from that kind of society? Unlike the Western journalists who made some of the dissidents, some of the male dissidents, household names around the world, I was not inclined to see them as liberals who had the misfortune of being born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. I wanted to treat them as far as possible in their own terms, to get to know them in their own language, and in the context that made them who they are. One thing that I struggled with while working on this book was the inconvenient fact that this was a tiny movement. You know, every historian wants his or her topic to be saturated with significance, and the size of a movement is one way to establish its relevance to a given time and place. But at the end of the day, I really couldn't change the fact that the number of core activists in this movement probably wasn't much more than 1,000. And we can talk later about who's a core activist and who's a consumer of dissident ideas. But it really was a tiny movement at the end of the day, 1,000 core activists in a country with roughly 250 million people. The movement's lifespan is roughly from the early 1960s to the early 1980s. So roughly a 2-decade period, which coincides with what nobody at the time knew, but we all know now, was the final chapter of the Cold War. And the Cold War is a huge factor in the movement's evolution over time, not just because these Western journalists that you mentioned turned out to be crucial conveyors of news about dissidents to the outside world, but also because the dissident movement, in a way, is part of the history of the longest, the most compelling, and I think even now, the most relevant facet of the Cold War, and that was the war of ideas between East and West. There's lots more that I could say, but I hope the overview is helpful. Maybe I'll just add a word about geography. The Soviet Union, like Russia now, was a highly centralized system, much more like France, where Paris is the nerve center of everything: commerce, wealth, culture, you name it. That was the story with Moscow too. And the vast majority of dissidents that I try to bring to life in this book lived in Moscow. But there were also crucial players in other major Soviet cities: Kyiv, Leningrad, Novosibirsk, and others. And I tried in the book to do justice to the Union-wide, the Soviet Union-wide character of the movement. So even though it was small, it had representatives all over the country, and especially in the European parts of the country. But Russia and the Soviet Union were and are so large, so diverse, that in the end, I didn't feel like I fully did justice to that, the geographical diversity of the movement.
Maybe say a few words about the sources. And also, by the time you started working on the project, some of the dissidents were still alive and you could talk to them. But I would say most of them were no longer alive. What were your sources, apart from the interviews that, as far as I understand, you were able to have with those who were still alive?
Yes, I did do some interviews, which was not something that came naturally to me, because I was trained mostly in 19th century history of Russia and Europe, where all of the protagonists are good and dead. And they can't move the goalpost on you. Everything is sort of fixed in one or another form of textual evidence. In this case, indeed, when I started the project, there were still some very important players in the movement who were still alive, and I did get to meet and interview some of them. including the person who emerged in my thinking as the intellectual godfather of the movement, this extremely eccentric Moscow mathematical logician named Alexander Volpin, who's the subject of the opening chapter in the book. The interviews were useful, but frankly, almost all of the dissidents that I did interview had done many, many interviews before I showed up. And I often found that their answers felt rehearsed to me, not in the sense of deceptive, but they'd been asked a lot of similar questions before and they had set answers, which was frustrating to me. And the technique that I began to develop to overcome that problem was to show up at the interviews with photocopies of archival documents in which they were implicated. Sometimes it was a copy of a page from their diary that had ended up in an archive in Moscow or St. Petersburg. Sometimes it was a page or two of their interrogation transcripts in the various encounters with the KGB that they had had in the 1960s and 70s or early 80s. Those were fantastic conversation starters. And the ones who had good memories, and quite a few of them had excellent memories, were able to reinsert themselves into the contexts in which those documents had been created and to give me useful information about the gestation of those documents, but above all, to save me from some truly stupid mistakes. I'll give you one example because it's kind of colorful. So this guy, Alexander Volpin, whose mathematical work is so abstruse that even my colleagues in the math department at Penn have no idea really what he was up to. He was the representative of, I think, a school that he invented called ultra-intuitionism in mathematics. And please don't ask me to explain what that is because I can't. But he wrote something about himself in his diaries in the 1950s that perplexed me. He described himself as an anarchist at the same time that he was developing a philosophy of the rule of law, which became the backbone, the grand strategy of the dissident movement, which was to try to get the Soviet state to abide by its own laws, its own constitution, its own code of criminal procedure. And I just could not figure out how someone who was so oriented towards law and law-abiding behavior could be an anarchist. And I asked him, why did you describe yourself that way? And he turned to me, this is all in Russian, he turned to me and said, well, if we'd had the word libertarian, I would have used that. And all of a sudden, all of the mental acrobatics that I had been going through to try to reconcile anarchism with rule of law evaporated, and his position and his positionality in Soviet society started to become clear. And there were other instances in which I was saved from my own wrong turns by dissidents in interviews. Now, having said all that, I have to tell you that the book is mostly based on archival documents and on published memoirs and some unpublished memoirs by dissidents. At the end of the day, I am a historian, not a journalist, and I much prefer fixed textual evidence than oral interviews, which can change, depending on whether you conduct them when the person has a stomach ache or is feeling great. So the sources of the book are varied. An amazing number of dissidents and an amazing proportion of the movement produced book-length autobiographies. So I talked about roughly 1,000 core activists, 150 of them, 15%, published book-length memoirs. I don't think there's ever been a social movement anywhere in which such a high proportion of participants thought that their lives were worth capturing in a public text like that. And those were a goldmine. And fantastic reading in the best cases. But they're also a bit treacherous because if all you read are the memoirs, then you're sort of trapped in this echo chamber of the dissidents' rendition of their own lives. And every historian who's worth his or her salt knows that while you want to become intimately familiar with the worldview and the moral and political categories of your actors, you can't become hostage to that worldview. You need a place to stand outside of what your protagonists knew and believed or thought they believed or understood. So I needed a way to get outside of the memoirs. And for me, the escape hatch was the KGB. materials, the many, many thousands of transcripts of interrogations of dissidents when they were in their 30s and 40s, before anyone could even imagine that the country in which they lived would collapse like a house of cards in 1991. When people write memoirs after a world historical event like the collapse of the Soviet Union, it colors everything they say about the preceding period. So this was another source of treachery with these memoirs. But the KGB transcripts unfolded in real time. They have their own problems. You know, people don't always reveal themselves in an interrogation. They don't always tell the truth. But they said very, very interesting and valuable things for any historian. And in case you're wondering whether I got permission to work in the archive of the KGB in the Lubyanka building in Moscow, the answer is no, I did not. The closest I got was getting power of attorney from several dissidents or their descendants to give me permission to work with their dossiers, but I never got permission to actually enter the building and use those materials. The good news, though, was, and people from that part of the world can back me up if they're so inclined, in Russia, there's always a back door. There's always what they call a chorny khod, a back door to the problem, a back door to the building. And for me, the back door into the KGB was that when the Soviet Union disintegrated in December of 1991, it broke up into 15 different republics. Every one of those republics had a branch of the KGB. Every one of those branches had its own archive. And I was lucky enough to work extensively in the Lithuanian branch of the KGB in Vilnius, which received many, many communications from the center. Remember, I said the Soviet Union was a highly centralized country. The mother lode, the archive in Moscow, was constantly sending things to the so-called provincial offices of the KGB. And there are especially valuable collections in Kyiv and in Vilnius, including many of the interrogation transcripts that ended up being central to my work. There are other genres of documents that I worked with, but the memoirs and the interrogation transcripts, I think, are the heart of what I tried to do.
Thank you. Would you please talk a little bit about the time? You emphasize in the book that the time when the Soviet dissidents emerged was no longer Stalin's Soviet Union, a totalitarian state. The state became different, and I really like the way you described it as a lip service state. So what do you mean by that? And if that state were freer, not free, but freer than the totalitarian state of Joseph Stalin, how did people take advantage of that? Not necessarily dissidents, even though, of course, we are most interested today in the dissidents, and this is what your book is about, but how people, Soviet people at large, were using the new freedoms.
So the Soviet system, as a set of institutions, came into its own under Stalin. Stalin was in power for 25 years. There was a time when I thought nobody would match that length, but Putin has now exceeded it. Putin has ruled for longer than any Russian or Soviet ruler in the 19th and 20th centuries. But it was during those 25 years under Stalin that the Soviet Union really came into its own. And not to be too simple about the thing, but there were basically three pillars that held this system up. There was the one-party rule of the Communist Party, which exercised an explicit monopoly on political power. No other parties allowed. There was the command economy, a centrally organized economy in which prices and wages and all of the other indices of economic behavior were set, not always successfully, but set from the center, also known as the command economy. And the third pillar of the Stalinist system was the use or the threat of the use of state-sponsored terror. And I use that word in its classic meaning of randomized violence, so that nobody feels safe, so that you can be punished even if you've done nothing. That's how you instill fear in the maximum number of people, is if you randomize it. That's the essence of terrorism in the classical sense. And one of the most dangerous things you could be under Stalin during these periodic purges, mass arrests, millions of people sent to the Gulag, to the forced labor camps. One of the most dangerous things you could be was a high-ranking member of the Communist Party, as ironic as that may sound. And the truly most dangerous arena to work in under Stalin was in the security police. The very apparatus that was charged with carrying out these randomized punitive mechanisms also was witness to extraordinary degree of turnover. Turnover here is kind of a euphemism. The leaders of the predecessor of the KGB, it was known as the NKVD in the 30s, they themselves very frequently fell victim to this vortex of punishment. They rarely lasted more than a year or two. They were either executed or committed suicide. So when Stalin died in March of 1953, his successors in the Politburo, the highest level of the Communist Party, were desperate to put an end to these cycles of violence, which put them at greater risk than almost anybody else. They were determined to stop using state-sponsored terror as an instrument of governance. And when Nikita Khrushchev emerged eventually by 1956 as the successor to Stalin, he essentially embarked on a truly historical wager. Can you run the Soviet system without that third pillar? Can you retain one-party rule, command economy, but cease to exercise random violence against large numbers of Soviet citizens? That was the gamble. My impression is that the answer was yes, you could. The Soviet system entered its second act in this 20th century drama. And the second act, the post-Stalin half of Soviet history, is very, very different from the first. As a matter of fact, one of the thought experiments that I run with my students at Penn who are studying Soviet history is, which is the greater contrast between Stalin's Soviet Union and Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's Soviet Union, the first and the second acts of this drama, or between the Soviet Union and Putin's Russia? We don't have to go into the details, but I don't think it's an open and shut question which contrast is greater. And one of the unintended consequences of subtracting state-sponsored terror from this repertoire of governing practices was to unintentionally open a space whose borders nobody could define and were never defined legally, to open a space for dissent. So it was Khrushchev's gamble that made something like the dissident movement possible. Nothing like what I describe in the book would have been possible in the 1930s and 1940s. Every one of the activists would have been shot before anything significant had happened. So studying the dissident movement did shape my view of the structure of Soviet history. I spent a lot of time working with KGB materials, and I wanted to take the KGB seriously as an intelligence service. I wanted to do justice to what it was trying to do, and what it was trying to do was professionalize itself. It was trying to not be the NKVD. It was trying to go after people who had actually done something. And it was trying to use the Soviet judicial system and evidence collected against these people to put them on trial and make examples of them to the rest of the population. So even though, as you said, the dissidents are only part of the story of the second half of Soviet history, it really had a big impact on how I understood the difference between the first and second halves.
Yeah, which certainly brings us to what was the something that the dissidents did?
Sure. So this Alexander Volpin character, who nobody's heard of, he did not make headlines. He was obscure. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for Literature the way Alexander Solzhenitsyn did. He didn't win the Nobel Prize for Peace the way the great physicist Andrei Sakharov did. He was not really covered by Western journalists in the 1960s and 70s. But Volpin did something of extreme significance for Soviet history, and I think for the history of the rule of law in the 20th century. In the course of pursuing his interest in cybernetics, which is a predecessor to computer science, and in the course of reading a lot of stuff by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was one of the founders of what's called ideal language philosophy. Vulpen, who remember was a mathematician, interested in the nature of truth statements in mathematics. That's what mathematical logic is about. Vulpen embarked on his own quest for an ideal language in which he and eventually others could express with perfect clarity and precision, the kind of clarity and precision that makes mathematics beautiful, that he could express in this ideal language all of the things having to do with moral obligations and prohibitions. He followed Wittgenstein in the sense of believing that most of the philosophical problems that we have struggled with for thousands of years are really secondary effects of the ambiguity of our language. And that if we could operate in a medium, in a language that was free of those ambiguities, we would make enormous progress in every domain of knowledge. We probably don't have time now, but if there's interest in the Q&A, I can give you some everyday examples of linguistic ambiguity and the problems that it creates and what Vulpen was up against. He never did create an ideal language, but in the course of one of his early episodes of imprisonment, first in a actual prison and then in a psychiatric hospital against his will, he had a lot of time to do reading, and he went to the prison library and he discovered the text of the Soviet Constitution, the Soviet Criminal Procedure, and other legal tomes. He read them cover to cover, and he paid particular attention to the sections on civil liberties. And what he found in the Soviet Constitution, which was ratified on the eve of the greatest wave of state-sponsored terror in 1936, right on the eve of 37, what he found astonished him, because in the Soviet Constitution, and you can read this yourself if you don't believe me, are some very robust statements about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press. It's true that they're all couched under the umbrella of building a socialist society. They all have to contribute to that collective project, but there are guarantees of freedom of expression, of civil liberties that Vulpen was astonished to find. And having failed to produce an ideal language that would have the precision and the clarity of mathematics, he retreated to plan B, and that was Soviet law was a good enough approximation of an ideal language. It too was attempting to articulate with maximum clarity what you may do, what you must do, and what you are forbidden to do. Those are the three categories of modal logic: permission, prohibition, exhortation. And so he had this idea that he could use Soviet law to advance the agenda of the rule of law generally, and specifically of containing the power of the Soviet state by using its own laws to reduce the arbitrariness of governance. And as he wrote in one of his diary entries in the late 1950s, I have my theory, I'm just waiting for the occasion to use it. The occasion arose in 1965 when two otherwise obscure Soviet writers were arrested for having published work abroad under pseudonyms, work that was obviously satirical, poking fun at the Soviet system. Poking fun is maybe too light. A critique of some of the more extreme features of the Soviet system, especially its Stalinist variety. And without going into all of the detail, Vulpen organized a demonstration on behalf of these writers. Their names were Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel. Those were their real names. Organized a demonstration in which the main agenda and what was written on the homemade posters that were held up was not free the Russian writers, or how dare you violate the great tradition of Russian literature, the pride and glory of this country. No, the slogan was honor the Soviet Constitution. This was the beginning of the dissident movement, and it was the inaugural moment. This was on December 5th, 1965, the anniversary of the ratification of Stalin's constitution. This was the inaugural moment of the grand strategy of that movement. Engage in lawful behavior that is explicitly protected by the Soviet constitution in an effort to persuade the Soviet state to do the same thing. It was all about lawfulness. In contrast to the chronologically roughly parallel American civil rights movement, The Soviet civil rights movement did not employ the technique of civil disobedience, which I'm sure many people in this room will remember or have studied. Civil disobedience is about deliberately breaking certain laws in order to call attention to their injustice. And in particular, the legal forms of racial segregation in the American South, which protesters would violate deliberately by sitting in a certain place on the bus, or sitting in a whites, if they were African Americans, sitting in a whites only part of a diner or a restaurant, in order to call attention to the injustice of those laws, and hopefully to bring in the federal government to override them. And by federal government, I mean either the National Guard or the Supreme Court or some higher authority. I'm saying all this because I think it can help clarify how different the grand strategy of the Soviet dissident movement was. It was a civil rights movement. It invoked the civil liberties enshrined in the Soviet legal system. But it engaged in a tactic that I would call, the dissidents didn't use this term, but I do, radical civil obedience, engaging in behavior that was explicitly protected by the law in order to send a message to the state that it should do the same. Another way of thinking about this is as a form of containment. If a government is not going to be lawless, that means it has to acknowledge that it is subject to certain constraints, legal, institutional, or otherwise. The tactic of radical civil obedience was an attempt to practice a kind of containment of the Soviet state. It's not the containment of George F. Kennan, the American diplomat who invented or popularized the idea of Cold War containment, which was about the United States constraining the external behavior of the Soviet state, eventually by, creating military bases in over 40 countries and essentially surrounding the Soviet Union with a kind of deterrent force. No, this was not geopolitical containment. It was domestic containment that sought to harness the power of Soviet law itself. It was extraordinarily clever, and most people in Volpin's circles of friends and acquaintances reacted to it with one or another version of, "Are you nuts?" or "Have you completely forgotten what country you live in?" or "How can you be so naive as to take Soviet law seriously? Don't you understand that it's just window dressing so that the Kremlin can appear to be a rules-following state for the benefit of either its own population or populations abroad?" To which Volpin would, as a rule, respond by saying, "You and that attitude are the problem." It's the cynicism of Soviet citizens who have concluded that their laws don't mean anything that enables and perpetuates the arbitrary behavior of the state. And if more people took Soviet law seriously the way Volpin did, it could actually become a source of traction. That was the quest of the dissident movement, to get more and more people to rethink the role of law under Soviet socialism and to participate in the project of mobilizing it for purposes of containing the state.
So not everyone apparently thought of Alexander Volpin as nuts. And this tactics was actually picked up by a few among the dissidents, or maybe more than a few. Now, how did the government respond to that? Apparently, this kind of tactics, honor your constitution, live by your own laws, was seeing the government of the Soviet Union as a counterpart, not as the enemy. And how did the government respond? What were the methods the government used to suppress the movement or to respond to the movement? And how did it evolve during the period of the 70s?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let's just say, for purposes of argument, that when we say the government, we really mean the KGB, because the KGB was the unit of the Soviet government that was tasked with dealing with this movement. I've read a lot of transcripts of Politburo conversations, and it's clear that Leonid Brezhnev, who emerged as Khrushchev's successor in the late 60s as the top dog in the system, the general secretary of the Communist Party, he was perplexed about why there should be any dissidents at all. This was the most progressive, forward-looking society on planet Earth. It had won the Second World War. Living standards were higher than ever. What could possibly be the problem? And his message to the KGB was essentially, you take care of it. So we're really talking about the security police when we talk about how the government reacted. The initial reaction was a lot of head scratching. The KGB was the inheritor institution of a unit of the government that went back to the revolution itself. The Cheka was the original version of this, the extraordinary commission for dealing with counter-revolutionary forces founded in 1918. They had vast experience dealing with all kinds of internal enemies. Monarchists, nationalists, religious believers, and perhaps most insidious of all, people who called themselves Leninists and Marxists, and who argued that the Communist Party had somewhere and somehow gone off the rails and needed to be brought back to the original ideals of the revolution. Fascists, you name it, every kind of opponent the KGB had experience dealing with, except for one, constitutionalists. This was not a position they were familiar with, and they were really initially at a loss to know how to respond to people who stood in Pushkin Square, one of the most iconic places in downtown Moscow, holding up a sign that says, respect the Constitution, respect the Soviet Constitution. Is that even illegal? Can you arrest someone for holding up that sign? There are some truly side-splitting transcripts of Volpin himself being interrogated by the KGB, where they ask him, why were you holding a sign saying, respect the Soviet Constitution? He, being a mathematical logician and a master of tautologies, answered by saying, so that people would respect the Soviet Constitution. And the conversation continued in that vein. And they really had a hard time figuring out what it was they could pin these people down with, what crime. They ended up, more often than not, accusing them of either hooliganism or disrupting public order. Pushkin Square is a very busy thoroughfare for pedestrians. And those of you who are from Moscow or have been to Moscow know that it's between two of the most heavily used metro stations in that system. So they got them on public disorder, holding an unsanctioned demonstration. Initially, the KGB, in the spirit of being no longer an instrument of terror, as it was under Stalin, tried to use the judicial system. They had real trials against dissidents in which they presented real evidence, and there was a prosecutor and a defense attorney and a judge. They tried Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel in February of 1966, and both of them were found guilty. One was sentenced to 5 years, the other to 7 years. The one who got 5 years got slightly less time because he'd served in the Soviet army during the Second World War, and that was considered commendable behavior on his part. So they tried to use the judicial system to be a modern security service, and what they found was that while they virtually every time they got the guilty verdicts they were after, I may as well tell you they got the guilty verdicts because the KGB would call the judge in the case before the trial began and say, you're going to give so-and-so 5 years and you'll give the other one 7 years. This is what Russians call telephone justice, telefonная prava. They got the guilty verdicts, but the PR fallout from these trials was a disaster for the Soviet government. Over and over again, they turned unknown or relatively unknown figures into martyrs. They made them famous overnight. And when I say famous, I mean, headline, front page famous on the New York Times, Washington Post, the Sunday Times, Le Monde. Every major Western newspaper was covering the dissident movement. It was the story. It was a deeply satisfying story for Western liberals who were sympathetic with this campaign for the rule of law. And so gradually what happened was the KGB became frustrated with the failure to achieve political dividends from these trials. They got the guilty verdicts, but they lost the battle for public opinion. And so they started moving away from trials and engaging in extrajudicial forms of punishment, which is exactly the opposite of what the dissidents wanted to happen. They were, after all, striving for a rule of law state. And the KGB was moving in the opposite direction. The subtitle of the book is The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement, and that there's kind of a double entendre going on there. One of the meanings is we need to look way beyond the Sakharovs and the Solzhenitsyns to discover the people who built the movement and who evolved with it over time. Volpin is just the tip of the iceberg. Many of the unknown people, the other lives that didn't get covered, were lives of women who didn't get taken seriously as leaders or major players in the movement because they were women and because, with all due respect, all of the Western journalists who were covering it in real time were male, and they were products of America, in the 1960s and 70s, and they didn't look on the women activists as credible candidates for leadership. And they would also, they would refer to Yelena Bonner as Mrs. Sakharov, which, nobody ever called her that in Russia. And that was just a kind of symbolic hint at some of the blinders that they had. But the other meaning of the many lives of the Soviet dissident movement is that movement went through several near-death experiences as a result of KGB suppression. And each time it emerged from that near-death experience of almost being snuffed out, it had to reinvent itself. Its format, its modus operandi, its allies, either in the Soviet Union or increasingly in the West. The grand strategy of using law as a source of leverage never changed, but the shape of the movement and its procedures, its degree of organization changed quite significantly over those 20 years that I mentioned at the outset. So that's the other many lives of the movement. Near-death experiences, almost like reincarnations into new forms.
So one last question before we give the floor to the audience is, how did the dissident movement end and when was it? And actually, it was not many years before the Soviet Union collapsed. And yet, at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed and the new Russia emerged, dissidents barely played any role. Quite a few of them were still alive. Many of them were abroad. But Russia never had anybody like Adam Michnik in Poland, like Lech Walesa in Poland, like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia. Why is that?
Well, the Soviet movement met its demise, was crushed for the final definitive time by the KGB in the early 1980s. And I don't want to go into too much detail because we need time for Q&A with the audience, but they reacted to the failure of their initial strategy, or their initial technique, I should say, of appealing to Soviet law by shifting their point of reference to human rights law, global law. And by doing so, by going from a domestic to an international arena, they, I don't want to say unwittingly, but without a lot of forethought, inserted themselves into the Cold War relationship between the two superpowers. On the one hand, that was a source of enormous leverage because now they had international NGOs like Amnesty International commenting on Soviet violations of human rights. And eventually they had members of the US Congress commenting on those violations. And the dissidents were the ones who got the information about those violations out to the world. But the same thing that made that a potent form of dissent also made it extremely dangerous because, like most states, and especially like most authoritarian states, the Soviet government was extremely jealous of its monopoly on foreign policy. It did not want any other entity from Soviet society interfering, certainly in superpower relations. And it's when the dissidents entered that danger zone, that powerful but dangerous zone, that's when the KGB said, okay, it's over. And they, by 1980, I would guess that, estimate that roughly half of those core activists, those core 1,000 people who had put their names on open letters and sometimes their addresses and phone numbers, had been forced out of the country. And of the roughly 500 who remained, many of them were in prison or internal exile. But you asked a deeper question, which is why is it that during the Gorbachev era and after, when it became possible to be openly politically engaged and run for office, why there was no Soviet Miknik or Valesa or Havel. Here's where things get really interesting. And this is something I struggled with quite a bit when I was working on the book. Almost without exception, Soviet dissidents insisted that theirs was not a political movement. I, being an American liberal, had become accustomed to looking at them as the most politically engaged people in their country, apart from the ruling nomenclatura. I thought they were eminently politically engaged, but one of the consequences of building a grand strategy around law and proceduralism is that it allowed them to think of themselves as not being political and to carry on a very long-standing Russian, then Soviet, and once again Russian tradition of regarding politics as, by definition, dirty, morally contaminated, gryaz, as the Russians would put it. That you cannot be politically engaged without morally compromising yourself. And that kept many of them away from any kind of direct political engagement when that became possible. And the few who broke through that taboo, including Andrei Sakharov, who ran for public office in 1989 and was elected to the Congress of People's Deputies, he had some very bitter discussions with fellow dissidents who said, how could you possibly join this Soviet government in any capacity? You're sullying your good name and by implication, the good name of the movement. And Sakharov was in some ways he and a handful of others were the exception that proved the rule, that this was a movement profoundly uneasy about direct political engagement. They certainly never aspired to capture the state, let alone run things, become rulers of a country. So it's one of the several sort of organizing paradoxes of the movement that what appeared to be the ultimate form of political engagement, they understood as something very different, as a moral and legal stance.
Thank you. And I think we should now, yeah, please. Sir.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Eric Mao. I'm the founder of Geopolitical Forum and also a partner at that organization. Thanks the author, Professor Nathan, and help me appreciate the complexity and the legwork included of writing this book. And my question is, in the beginning of the talk, you mentioned those dissidents or the movement of it, if I can call it that way. It's not because those people happen to be born on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And also you mentioned in Bushnev, I don't want to butcher the Russian name, when he was reported by his subordinates that we have this dissidents and you have to deal with it, he's like, we had done nothing wrong. We actually done pretty well compared to the previous eras of the Russia history. So meaning we have nothing to improve. So you go ahead, KGB, deal with the way you deal with it.
That's the case when government, the Soviet government, has dealt with it as such. The pension spies, the outside containment.
Sure. The leading theory inside the KGB was that the dissident movement consisted of people who were puppets of Western intelligence services. It was almost inconceivable to them that those people could emerge as organic products of Soviet society itself. And yet that is my argument. I try to make the case in the book that every orthodoxy produces its own specific heresy. And the legalist approach to dissent was the specific or one of the most specific heresies associated with Soviet socialism. And by the way, that's why you find in virtually every country that was built on the Soviet model, whether it's communist Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Mao Zedong's China, or Vietnam, or Cuba, dissident movements emerge with remarkably similar characteristics to those that I tried to capture in this book. Heavy emphasis on law and proceduralism, and insistence that they are not anti-choose your country, but rather merely trying to assist the government in the fulfillment of its own laws. We know, and I've seen many CIA analyses of the dissident movement, that the CIA was engaged in a long-running campaign of what they liked to call psychological warfare against the Soviet Union. Yes, the CIA was trying to get Soviet citizens to see how much better the standard of living was in the United States. They were surreptitiously sending millions of books and articles to people on the other side of the Iron Curtain in an attempt to spread ideas that the Soviet government had banned from print literature in their own country. And not just George Orwell and Friedrich Hayek, but a whole range of fiction and nonfiction works. But what I also found was that the CIA had no direct connection with the dissidents. And in fact, almost every CIA analysis of the movement was very pessimistic. Too few people, too isolated from the rest of Soviet society. And worst of all, they're not even trying to engage in regime change. They have these weird ideas about Soviet rule of law. So the CIA was also skeptical about whether law could be a source of leverage inside what it regarded as a totalitarian system. So because of the way the KGB stigmatized the dissidents as puppets of Western intelligence services, I'm very sensitive to that charge. And the short answer to my question would therefore be no. The CIA was not in cahoots with the dissidents. The dissidents were, these are highly educated people, many of them from the STEM fields with very rigorous training. They understood almost intuitively how dangerous it would be to create even the appearance of a link to Western intelligence services. So they studiously avoided that wherever possible.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Danil Lishchishin. I'm a history PhD student here at Northwestern. My question builds upon your comment about how dissidents perceive themselves. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit more to the audience about how you defined dissidents in the ones you study. Because of course, there is a phenomenon, especially in some of the post-Soviet successor states, such as Ukraine, where there are some figures that society commonly calls dissidents, but then you interview them and they say, no, I was never a dissident. I was a nationalist. I was something else. And so I'm interested if you could just get into a bit more into who you're qualifying as a dissident, because I think that will also help to reinforce to the audience your points about how dissidents perceive themselves. Because if how dissidents perceive themselves, then it's how people who are called dissidents may not perceive themselves.
Yep. It's a terrific problem to bring up. Well, what's interesting to start with is that you don't have to wait to the post-Soviet period to find people who dispute being labeled that way. Dissidents in the 1960s and 70s, almost without exception, strongly disliked the term, and for some very simple reasons. First of all, it's a foreign word that was imported into Russian and other languages. So in Russian, it's dissident. And this reinforced the KGB's claim that there was something foreign about these people. If you could label them with a foreign word, it made them already sound like outsiders. But there's a deeper problem, which is the meaning of the word itself. So dissident comes from the Latin for dissidere, which means to sit apart. A dissident in Latin is he who sits apart. And it traditionally has been used to describe religious sectarians, whether Protestants in Catholic countries or Quakers in Protestant countries, people who wanted to essentially excise themselves and to, I don't know if they wanted to be religious sects, but that's the way they were cast, as sort of separatists. And this too was not something that the dissidents, I'm using the word reluctantly, wanted the world to think about them. They saw themselves as being active in their societies as taking up important legal and moral issues. So they didn't like it. And the Soviet dissidents had other words that they preferred. One of them, their favorite, was in Russian, inakomyslie, which, as you can tell, is a mouthful to say, especially if you're not a native speaker, and it means literally other thinker. These were members of the intelligentsia, after all, and they prided themselves on not thinking like the herd, being independent thinkers. So there are two problems with that. One is actually more than two. First problem is it's really hard to render in Western languages in a way that sounds decent. Other thinkers, kind of, what does that mean? The second is that what really distinguished the people that I'm calling dissidents was not what they thought. It's what they said out loud. Lots of people thought all kind of heterodox things about the Soviet system. The dissidents were that small minority that actually did something about it, that actually acted on those ideas. So it too, on the level of semantics, is not really a good descriptor of the people that it purports to describe. The other term that they liked was pravozащитник, rights defender. Now that's a good one. That's really accurate. That is what they did. They defended the rights that were already enshrined in the Soviet Constitution. But the translation into other languages was problematic. Rights defender is not really a going term. And it was the Western journalists, Masha, who you mentioned at the outset, who really set the word dissident on its path, and it never lost its power over as a descriptor. And the dissidents, the people described as dissidents, never stopped disliking it. I asked myself early on in this project, could I just avoid that word and use something else? That's often a very useful tool for an historian, not to rely too heavily on one word, because it becomes a substitute for analysis. It sort of lays out the terms of the story from the get-go. And I thought about that long and hard. Can I write this book without using the word dissident? Couldn't do it. I could not do it. It was so pervasive in the sources, both the dissidents themselves and the journalists who covered them and the KGB interrogation transcripts, that it would have been like cutting off a limb. So I ended up using it. But I do discuss why it's problematic and the dissidents' very complicated relationship to it. So thank you for asking that.
My name is Yefim Cutler. I grew up in the Soviet Union and very well remember the time. So I was born after the World War II, and I came of age in early 60s, and I remember the time. So my question is historical question. Khrushchev didn't leave on his own will the leading role. He was removed from power, and eventually Brezhnev succeeded. Do you think dissident played a role that they decided to go back, perhaps to tightening the knots, so to speak, and remove the liberties that opened up in early 60s?
No, I don't. I don't think the dissidents played any role in Khrushchev's removal from power. That was in October 1964. What really, I think, explains his the peaceful coup d'etat against him by Brezhnev and other Politburo members was the erraticness of his policies, both domestic and foreign. He changed his mind about a lot of things. He would move in one direction and then zigzag in a different direction. In addition to the political chaos that sowed in the Soviet Union, the foreign policy versions of that zigzagging were humiliating. And of course, the most famous example is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev had essentially to publicly go home with his tail between his legs and remove all of the Soviet nuclear weapons from the island of Cuba. It was humiliating, and it made him look like he hadn't thought through the consequences of stationing nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. He just hadn't thought in advance. He didn't manage that affair like a good chess player, thinking several moves ahead of time. Those were the things that sort of destroyed the patience of his Politburo allies. The dissident movement really didn't get underway until after he was removed. But it's a good point that you're making. I would just turn it in a slightly different direction. One of the reasons for the urgency of the movement when those two writers were arrested in 1965 was that the people who would soon become known as dissidents were asking the same question as everybody else. What happens after Khrushchev? Are we going back to Stalinism? Are we going to revert to the system under which the Soviet Union came into its own? Will the KGB start arresting people for no visible reason and sending them to hard labor for 25 years? People were very, very scared about what would come after Khrushchev. And since you grew up there, you know that in the Soviet Union, the process of leadership transition is completely opaque. There are no rules or procedures governing leadership succession. And by the way, there aren't any in Russia today, which is why not only does nobody know who will succeed Putin, nobody has any idea what the process will be by which somebody emerges as Putin's successor. There are no laws governing that transition. So people were very afraid about a relapse into Stalinism, and that made the legal approach even more compelling. Like, we cannot go back to a situation where the state can do whatever it wants with impunity. We need the constraints of law.
I'm Nina Wida, a faculty member here at Northwestern. I found it very interesting how you analyze these self-narratives of their lives alongside KGB records. And I'd like to hear what the biggest conceptual difference you uncovered, or perhaps a new insight that came of this approach.
Thank you. There's something about the genre of autobiography that foregrounds the individual. And there's something about the force field of the Cold War that favors a story in which the hero of the autobiography is an intrepid foe of a totalitarian system. So those are some of the themes and motifs that almost always rise to the surface of the memoir texts. This heroic individual and the story of how they became who they are. If you read the interrogation transcripts, it's as if the KGB had been studying network theory for its entire existence. All they wanted to do, they could not have cared less about the intellectual content of dissident thought. They never asked people, how did you become a dissident? How did you get involved in this movement? They didn't engage in any of the practices for which Stalin's secret police became famous or infamous, which was that the Stalin secret police wanted to get into the depths of your soul and understand who you were at the deepest level and how you had become who you became. The KGB really didn't care. They were, I would say, politically apathetic. What they wanted to know is, where did you get that samizdat, that self-published text from? Who gave it to you? Do you know so-and-so? One of the most incredible archival discoveries that I came upon was in the archive in St. Petersburg of the human rights organization Memorial. And they have the KGB investigative record against a certain dissident. And in that file, they actually drew a kind of hub and spoke model, which is how network theory is traditionally done. You have the leader is the hub, and then there are a series of spokes emanating out from that center circle, and then littler circles outside it, and then the cross connections between this little circle and that little circle. And you're trying to reconstruct visually, using network tools, what the system of distribution was. So ironically, the KGB took a highly collectivist approach to the dissident movement, which I found very useful. I also wanted to know what the social ambiance of these people was. I got to be a little suspicious of the intrepid warrior story. But that made it very useful for me to have both kinds of sources. There are, needless to say, other ways in which those two genres of texts differ, but that's the one that really jumped out at me when I started working with them.
Thank you. I loved your book, and one of the things I found so interesting was when you talked about the kind of culture of this early dissident movement, this idea of both the government and the dissidents themselves having a reverence for the written word, a tradition of memorizing texts and being able to recite them back. And yet at the same time, as you just pointed out, a lot of the central figures were from what we would call STEM fields. And it struck me that in the United States, often in the academy, we think of these as two completely different styles of thinking. And yet in this case, they seem to come together. So is there something distinctive about Soviet intellectual culture that enabled this?
Absolutely. And it's not just Soviet intellectual culture, it's the much older intellectual cultures of Russia and Ukraine and other sort of allied or associated societies. One of the things that I really admire most about the intellectuals who I've gotten to know, either textually or in person or both, from that part of the world, is their utter contempt for disciplinary boundaries and the breadth of their engagement with problems. So yes, many of the dissidents came from STEM fields, mathematicians, computer scientists, physicists, engineers, but they too had been forced to memorize vast quantities of Pushkin when they went through the Soviet school system. And I see some smiles over here. Anybody who went through that school system, I think, will back me up on this. There was an intense emphasis on internalizing texts, making them part not just of your memory, but of your guts, really getting them inside you. And it goes beyond that. I mean, most of the people who embraced Volpin's philosophy of using law as a source of leverage, they were what we would call jailhouse lawyers. They had no formal training in the law, and yet they were absolutely fearless in making pronouncements about law and jurisprudence and, the kind of attitude that in our system, you'd be laughed out of the room because you don't have the right degree, the right specialty. So there's something absolutely wonderful and impressive about this fearless ranging across disciplines. It can produce some dilettantism, but when it's in the hands of someone who's a real thinker, it's exhilarating to watch that happen.
Thank you very much. My name is Isa Ding. I teach in the political science department. I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned the Russian or tradition of intellectuals seeing themselves, or intellectuals seeing politics as dirty. But then there's the simultaneous kind of this idea of working within the system because that's the rule of law angle. And it just kind of reminds me of in China studies, and you also talked about the similarities between Vietnam, China, Russia. And in China studies, the way in the relationship between intellectuals and state are described often is that intellectuals have historically play the role of advisor to the state, so the loyal dissident, so to speak. So they don't necessarily see politics as dirty and then try to distance themselves from it. At least that's the way we teach our students. And then we oftentimes use the example, well, that's different from the West, including Russia, because the Russian tradition, intellectual tradition, is very much still kind of mired in the West, even though developed vis-a-vis the West. I was wondering if you can say a little more about that, the development of the Russian intellectuals thinking about their position within the system and vis-a-vis the state and over time. And then if I could add a second question, obviously, no need to answer. And then I can't wait to read a book. I'm sure your book probably answers both of my questions, but can you say a bit about the afterlives of the dissidents? Because many of the Chinese dissidents from the Tiananmen student movement. They came to the US. And I'm just wondering how the Russian dissidents engaged with politics in the United States. So, for instance, many Chinese dissidents became a member of MAGA in recent years. And that's kind of a really interesting twist of events and counterintuitive, but also makes sense in other regards. So,
yeah. Okay. So let me try to deal with the questions in order, and we have relatively little time left. I've just been informed. So where to begin? Well, I'll start with the second one. Many Soviet emigres, that's a much larger group than Soviet dissident emigres, were enthusiastic supporters of Reagan republicanism, Ronald Reagan's republicanism from the 1980s. And the reasons are not that difficult to find. Reagan had a much more emphatic way of confronting the Soviet Union. He was openly anti-communist in a way that few democratic politicians in this country were. And that appealed to many, not all, but many immigrants from the USSR. I don't really think I know enough about the level of support for Trump's Republican Party. But whatever it is, it doesn't strike me as anywhere near as generalizable as the support for Reagan. I think there's actually among my circle of Russian emigre friends, who I'll be the first to admit are not representative of the whole group, but among them, there's a sense of terror at what Trump is doing to constitutional protections and the rule of law in this country, not to even mention what used to be his kind of cozying up to Putin and lack of sympathy for Ukraine in this terrible assault by the Kremlin. So I don't have any special expertise in the political affinities of former Soviet citizens in Trump's America, but my anecdotal sense is that it's nowhere near what it was for Reagan. We could have a different version of this conversation if we talked about the many, many Soviet immigrants who ended up in Israel and where they stand on the Israeli political spectrum and how that's shifting generationally, but that's perhaps for another conversation. Your first question was about the role of advisor to the government. It's interesting to hear you say that there's sort of a known cultural space for that role in the Chinese system. There sort of was in the Soviet system too, but it was tongue-in-cheek. Some of the Soviet dissidents would describe the work they do as literally assisting the Soviet government in its compliance with various human rights norms. And everybody understood that that was a euphemism, that what they were actually doing was gathering damaging information about the violations of human rights, sending it to the West, and getting the West to complain and put pressure on the Kremlin. And I should say that, you know, when people think of Russian and Soviet history, it's usually pretty grim and dark. You know, you think of these morose intellectuals sitting around drinking vodka and cursing and complaining about how terrible things are. But if you read the book, you will discover there was a tremendous amount of fabulous humor in this movement. And that kind of play acting of, oh, we're just advisors to the government, that elicited a lot of laughs, both among the dissidents and people adjacent to them. I just mentioned that because the book is not meant to be a Dostoevsky novel in its usual American reading. I shouldn't say that, though, because actually Dostoevsky himself is quite funny if you have access to the original Russian. Dissidents had a fantastic sense of humor. The toast that became the title of the book, "To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause," captures that deeply ironic sense of humor. And along with their sort of disciplinary fearlessness, what I really came to admire about many of these people was the way they could combine in their own selves a kind of boldness of thinking and acting with a sense of complete despair. You don't find this in Americans. Americans are too optimistic to have that combination, but the Soviet dissidents managed to contain both of those feelings inside themselves and not to let either one paralyze the other, which is a pretty remarkable thing to do. Thank you.
I'm just going to say people are leaving to go to class, and so we will close this event just to say thank you so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for coming.